Hi everyone, I'm Ricky Ochigbo, and welcome to this comprehensive tutorial on using Context API with Next.js and Typescript. In today's video, we'll dive deep into Context API with a powerful feature in React for managing state across your application. By the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to effectively use Context API to share state between components. You'll be able to organize your context logic, and then would look into writing unit tests. So as you see here, I have something like a table of contents where I talk about the topics we'd cover. So you would understand the fundamentals. So we'll talk about the fundamentals, and then I'll teach you how to create well-structured context providers and consumers, and then would go and see how we could like share data across the application, how you can pass data down or share data across components. And then I'll teach you how to organize this in a professional setting. If you're building an app for, like a large scale app that you have to like send to production, right? And once we're done with all those things, we'll look into like using like a step form example, right? And subsequently, and then I would talk about writing unit test. All right, friends, let's dive in. Please, if you're new to this channel, you're watching my videos for the first time, I'd appreciate if you like leave a comment and give some feedback. So you could also subscribe to the channel. So please, you could subscribe or you could just like and basically give a comment. Drop a comment to let me know if it helps you or things I could improve on. In subsequent tutorials, I'm going to be teaching mainly with Next.js, TypeScript related stuff, and I'm going to be teaching on AWS deployments and things like that. All right, let's jump in. The question we'll start off is with what is Context API? Right, so look at what Context API is and what problem it helps us solve. So like we said before, Context API is a feature of React that provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level, right? It's particularly useful when you want to share like things like your global states, right? That alternate, like what you would have done with Redux, you could use Context API for, passing global state or global data, right? So if you want to share data across multiple components, now this is where like Context API shines, right? Now, before we move ahead, let's just like draw some diagrams to see an example, right? So normally you have, let me see. Yeah. So normally in React, you have, say, the parent component. Right? And this parent component is going to have, let's say, child, for example. Let's just call this child1. Now, if you want to pass information from the parent down to the child, you want to pass information from parent down to the child, you use something called props, right? So you're passing data down, right? And this works. This is good. This is ideal. This works, right? This is a common practice in React. However, what's going to happen is that as your application grows, what is going to happen is that you're not just going to have one child, right? You're going to notice that you have like maybe this child one also has its own children. So you have something, let's just say grandchild one. Is a component of its own. Within that, you have, let's say, another child. There's another component, right? And you could even have a child one and just down. And this could go on all the way down to, let's say, grandchild n. Let's just say n, right? This could go on. There's no limits. There's nothing that limits, like, I don't know, as far as I know, there's no rule that limits the number of nested children we should have. Of course, you could like come up with ways to like, make this easier in the application, but right? So like I said, there's no limit to the number of children we could have. So what happens when, something happens and as your application grows, you have to pass data down from the parent all the way to the last grandchild, right? Or anywhere down the component tree. You want to pass data down. right? Now, of course, you could use the regular thing you've done before, which is that you could continue passing props down to child grandchild one, pass props down to child two, pass props down. All these are props, right? That you're passing down, right? And then finally you get the data somewhere in the last child, right? Now, this is something that you could try to do. Now, but if you pay close attention, you see that this already causes problem. And let's see what some of the issues are. You need your personal data from the parent down to this last grandchild here, right? But now you have to like go through all these components, right? These components do not need the data. You need the data somewhere here, the last grandchild, but you have to pass that. You understand? So that is something that's already cumbersome to do, right? And difficult to maintain. Another thing is that we are passing down props down to components that have no need you know, of knowing what these props are, right? So I would think that components should only, concern themselves with their business, right? Now, what you see here is what we call props drilling. That's a term for it, props drilling. And this is not a practice that's encouraging React. It's about practices, right? Now, so what solves this problem? This is an example of where context API would shine, right? How about if I told you that there's a cleaner way to do this, right? So rather than drill props, what you could do is say, okay, fine, let's move the screen a little bit. There's a parent component, right? Now, from this parent component, you pass the data you want to pass down to something called a provider, right? And this provider now passes the data down to your children. So child one, child two, child three, right? So this provider passes data down and wherever and somewhere, let's say on this child three, where you need access to this data, you have something called a consumer, right? I'm going to use a different color for that so that we can track that properly. So somewhere in child three, you have something called a consumer, right? That gives you access to the data from the parent, right? So once again, let's go over this flow. It's going to be parent passes data down to through a provider, Now this provider is going to make, that data that's passed down across the component tree, and in whichever of those components you need it, whether it's the 15th child or the 14th child or the infinite child, all you need to do is, use the consumer and you get access to that data. If you see this approach, right? This is already cleaner and makes a lot of sense than this, right? And this is what Context API helps us, do. Now, so the key things I just want you to take off from here is that, so first we have the Context API. And the key things, there's a provider that helps us pass data down. And then there's the parts that we consume the data, so the consumer, right? So these are the key components and these are the key takeaway you need to take away from that. Data down, data access to data, right? All right, friends, in the next section, I'm going to set up like a project and we would see how we'd use this in like practice. The project is going to be a very simple project. We're going to start out small and then we're going to build it into something more complex. All right, friends, now that we've understood what Context API is and what it does, in this section, we're going to get our hands dirty. Basically, we're going to start like writing code. What I have done here is that I've created a simple Next.js app with a few components, and I am in the default page, like the home page, right? And that's where like import the basic components, right? And if we go through, we could just see this is just a simple, functional components that just renders basic JSX, right? What we are going to do in this section is that we are going to implement context API. We're going to see how to like first would create context, right? So we'd learn how to create context, and then once we do that, we learn how to pass down data through the provider, through the context provider. And now that we have passed down data through the context provider, we would learn how to assess that data in our children components. So in any of these children components, you would want to see how you can assess that data from the context, right? So we'll just say assess, data from parent from provider. Let's just use that stem. Oh, so there's a context provider, so we don't do that, right? Using consumer or hooks. I would explain this when we get to that section. And lastly, we would see how to update the global states. I was going to say parent, let's just say parent state, right? So these are the things we're going to look into in this section. We'll write out the code for this and would see how, this works. First, I'll just open my terminal and I'll start this application. I think npm run dev. And this should start the application on port 3000. So if I go to my browser and I paste this here, yeah, so this is just what we have, right? Like I said, as a basic dummy component. What we want to see is how to pass, data down the component tree and set up context API. All right, let's start. So as we stated here, the first thing we want to do is want to create context, right? So to do that is that you're going to import the create context function from React. So how do you do that? You just come to the top of the file, you import from React, and there's a function in React called create context. Okay, my editor is playing games with me. So let's say from React. So we import the create context function from React, right? That's the first step, right? And this function that we've imported, it's going to help us achieve the step, which is create context. So we'll come here and we'll just say const. For now, I'll just say dummy context because this is just like we're playing around with it and seeing how it works. So I'll just say dummy context equals to create context, the function which we imported, and we'll call that function. Now, if you see there's a red line here, and that's like an error from Typescript. So you see, like when I hover over it, it gives us like details. So it tells you that an argument for default value was not provided. So when you create a context, you should always like pass in a default value. Now, what's the default value? It could be anything you want, right? So you could pass in some like string, let's just say hello world, right? You could pass in an object that maybe contains maybe username, for example, name rookie, or whatever, right? So this is a value that you pass down by default, and this is at the start it's going to be available. But usually when I start out, I like to use undefined, right? So the default value is undefined, and as we build the application, we're going to like pass in, the kind of values we want. All right, good. So we've achieved the steps where we created our context. So I'll just mark this down. So congrats, we just successfully created our context, right? Now, let's just see what that context contains, right? So if I put this, so when you call this function, create context, it gives us an object, right? So, and this is going to be able to like use dot notation. We should see this. Now, as we stated in the introductory part of this tutorial, right? You notice that we have like three things there, which is the consumer, the provider. The display name for this section is not important. We are just going to focus on the consumer and the provider. We already explained what these things they do, right? So the provider is going to help us like, pass down the data, right? And the consumer is going to help us consume the data, right? So let's go to the next step. The next step is passing down data through the context provider. So what we will do, how you do make that happen is that you wrap so these are the children in your component tree you want to pass data to. So you'd wrap them with the context provider you just created. So how does that work? I'll say dummy context. The context we just created, if I put a dot, it's going to give me access to the provider. And here, I can now wrap my children, my child components within that provider. Now, if you notice there's a red line here, right? And it's telling you, what does that say? It says property value is missing, right? What's required. Now, so what does this, so basically what's the complaint about? That's a TypeScript error. Now, The provider is supposed to help us pass down value down to the children. But if you check, all we've done is that we've only wrapped our children with the provider, but we've not passed down any value, right? So to do that, you have the value prop, right? And now, once again, you could pass in like a value here, let's say like a string, random string, or whatever you want to pass in, right? And that works. Or you could even pass in undefined, or you could pass in null. Basically, this just gives us a way to pass in data here, right? So what I would do is here, I would say context value to pass down, right? Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to use an object, right? That sounds more like it sounds more realistic. So we could pass in an object that have, let's say, first name, right? I'm going to use my first name for now, and last name. I'm going to use my last name, right? And now I'll pass in the subject down the, what's it called? I'll pass it the subject down to the value props of our provider, right? So once again, wrap up the children component with the provider. The provider has a value prop, and we put in the value we want to pass down the component tree here. Now, once again, TypeScript is coming to the rescue and it's telling us about like, oh, it's not assignable to type undefined, right? So what happens is that because we pass in undefined when we're creating the context, what happens is that TypeScript is thinking that we only want to pass in like it infers. There's something called type inference in TypeScript, right? So based on this value, it's assuming that the context only is going to accept like type of undefined, right? But that's not the case. So what we would do here is that we'll define like a proper context type. I'll say dummy context type. So sorry, this is a TypeScript type, so you have to put the type before it. So type dummy context type equals to that. And what do we want to pass down? We want to pass in first name and last name. So I'd come here and say, I want to pass in a property first name, and that's a string, right? So this is a TypeScript now, and want to pass in last name, and this is also a string, right? So once you do that, you can now come here and put in your type definitions. And now it's going to complain about the undefined because undefined is not conform to this. So what I'm going to tell that is that I'm going to use this or and say undefined. So what did I do here? I created like a TypeScript type that is going to match the kind of that's the data shape we're passing down. And we're passing that type definition here. So we're saying that it's you're either passing something that conforms to the dummy data context type, or we're passing undefined. Once again, at the other point, I would explain what is undefined, why I started with undefined and not like maybe default object or something. Now, all right, so I'll just bring this terminal down here so we can see. So we just successfully completed the what's it called, the other part. So we created like the provider, and we're passing value down, right? Let me go to my browser and let me just see if the app's okay. Now, if you come to the browser, you notice that that the app is broken. Now, remember we're using Next.js, and the context API would only work, for the client side, right? It's not going to work on the server side. So to make this work, we just add this use client and tell Next.js that okay, this should work in the browser. This page should be rendered on the browser side. So if you could do that, now our app works properly, right? Good. Yeah, I'll just see something. I'll go to components. So if I use the profiler, let me see components, sorry. And if I scroll down, these components, this is going to show us like our components tree and stuff. So if you check here, this is just everything that wraps our application. If you see here, there's a context provider we just created. And if you can see, this is the value we're passing down, right? So we have the child one. For now, child one has no props, has nothing. So we're going to like see if we can access the value. But now you can see from the provider, we're passing value down. So that notices it. I'll just bring this down and stuff. So like I said, we successfully completed this part where we are passing down the data. The next step we want to look at is how do we assess this data that we have passed down, right? So how do we consume the data, right? All right, so I'll start off, let's say, with child one components. Let's see how we can access the data we're passing down the component tree. So if I go to child one, right, we want to use the context we just created. We want to have access to the data that's been passed from the parent. Now, to do this, you have to bring in the context consumer. So I'll go back to the parent component. I'm going to export the context we created so I can get access to the context consumer. So I'm exporting the context, right? And in child one, I would say import that context from the parents. I think the parent is currently located on the page. If I go down here, so it's located on the page, right? So I would bring in like dummy context, right? So this is from this context, remember, is an object, and from that object, we're going to have access to what's it called? Access to the consumer. So to do that here, I would just let me just comment this out so I can explain this properly. Right now, so we'd have the dummy context similar to what we have, but this time we say consumer, right? And this is going to like say it's missing the consumer props, right? So what is to get access to that, what you need to do, so we are accessing the consumer, but we now have to get access to the props and use that prop. So to do that, you have this curly braces within here. This is going to get a function, takes in a function, and that function is would now return your GXS, right? So what's by GXS, it returns basically this, right? So I'll take this out for now. So basically, we've wrapped our components with the consumer, right? But something is still missing, and what's missing is that we are not getting anything, right? So while we have wrapped that down, so to get access to the data from the parents, you have something called the value prop, which is going to be the structure that's which comes along. So from this function is going to give us access to the value prop, and so if I hover that, you see that it conforms to the context type, right? So what happens now is that we now have access to what's it called? The this value now has access to the to that now becomes it's equivalent to this value we're passing down, right? And how do I know that? I would just like print the data here. Let's just say div. I'll say JSON just for printing purpose. I'll say JSON dot stringify value, right? So remember this is child one. So when we go there, we should see that the value is printed to the screen, right? All right, let's go to our browser. And there you have it, right? So that's the value that's being printed out to the screen, right? So this is coming, once again, it's coming from the parent. We're passing down the data from the parent to the provider. And with the consumer, we have access to that data we're passing down. It's located in value, right? So if I should update this name and say, change it to, let's say, Willox, for example, right? You see that this is going to get updated, like that. So what we're doing here is that we're successfully passing data down, right, from the parent component. We're passing it down to the through using the consumer. We're having access. So we're passing it down correctly with the provider. We're having access to that using the consumer. Now, but there's something that's left. It's called the hooks, right? Now, these works, by the way, you understand. And why I'm using JSON.stringify. Let's make this even cleaner, and I'm going to explain something. Let's say I have a div here. I'll just say first name. So I'll say value dot first name, right? And put another div for this last name, so we get that correctly. Let's just make this last name, right? So let's see this. So it still works. We have the first names coming down. We have the last name. So that's still, we're passing, once again, passing it up, but we're passing this incorrectly. But I want to explain something. Now, while this works, while this approach where you're using the consumer to like assess the data from the parent, while this works, this is like an old approach and it has its drawbacks, right? You understand? So the what you would use in modern React and what is like a better approach is to use the React hooks, right? There's something called the context API hooks, right? And I'm going to show you how to use that here. So I'm just going to take this code. I'm going to comment this out so we can compare with the new code I'm going to provide. So To use that correctly, what you now need to do is that using the hooks pattern, what you do is that you say import from React again. There's something called use context, right? So this is a hook that's going to allow you to use like the context API. Now I am going to just remove this, remove the provider. Right? And within our, what's it called? Within our child component, I'm going to say const value from, or let's say value equals to use context, right? Where is this use context coming from? This is a use context that we are importing from React, right? And it's a function. You call that function, it takes in the context you want to use, right? So which context do we want to use? Want to use a dummy context, right? And this should work as before, right? So passing it to the value, like for the use context, passing the context we want to use, passing it to the value just the same way we have. And if we go back to our browser, you see that it still works. If I go back to the page and maybe I update this name to, I'm running out of names, let's just say Jane Doe, right? You see that we are still passing the data down correctly, right? We're still passing data down correctly. The component tree, right? Compare what we have here to the previous, approach where we're using the consumer. You find out that this is like a cleaner approach, like it looks neater, right? But it's not just that it's cleaner, right? You could also it's easier to also do other things. So for example, let's assume I wanted to further manipulate like things I'm getting from the context. Let's say in this case, I want to like maybe get the capital, I want to get the first name as capital later. So I could say um, capital, let's just do this, right? Capitalized first name or something, right? So this should be something like say value dot first name dot to uppercase, right? So what I'm doing basically is I wanted to, I want to convert first name to a capital letter, right? So if you should, bring that here, for example, and just say so we should see like a version of the first name that's like capital letter, right? If we go back to the browser, so let's refresh the browser, and so you could see here now that the capital letter name is like, what's it called? The capital letter. You could do other things, right? So this is an example of like if you wanted to manipulate this data further and stuff like that, right? So this would be like an approach that would use more often. All right, so let's see what we've achieved, right? So we've successfully been able to create a context. We've successfully been able to pass data down using the context provider, which is what we were showing here. I've shown you how to use consumers to assess this data that we're passing down, right? The context consumer. We've also seen how to use hooks, right? The next step we'll look at is seeing how we can update the parent, so we are passing data down, but how does a child communicate with a parent, right? So that's what we're looking at next, right? Okay, cool. Let's jump in. Before we look at how we would update the global states, so this is what we're supposed to do. Before we look at that, if you notice here, we are only passing it's passing the data down to like child one, right? I want us to like, also see the data in like child three. Remember, the goal was for us to share component and data across multiple components. All right, so once again, if you needed to use that same data, like this same data from the context, let's say in a different component, let's select child three, for example, right? All you need to do is just repeat the same thing. So all I need to, if I go to child three, for example, I could say, sorry, I could the first thing I would do is I would import um, the use context hook from React. So go to React, I would import the use context hook, right? Now that I've imported the use context hook, I would import the context object I want to use. Remember, once again, if you go down to parent, we created this context object, right? And we want to have access to this context in the child3 component. So to do that, I would go and say import from that component. I'd say from it's in page as before. I imported dummy context, right? So I've imported the use context hook. I've imported the dummy context, right? Now, so to do that here, I could simply just to use that now. I could now say const value. Let's say value from context. This would be equals to the use context hook, which is the function you call it. And now you pass in your context object into that, right? So I'll just do some cleanups format here, and I would update this text to say this is my first name. I'll just put the curly braces so I could, get that value from the context. So I'll say value.context that first name, right? This is my first name, and I'll just add another text here that says, and this is my last name. Can spell name. Once again, put curly braces here, and what you would have is value from context dot last name. Let's say if we format right, and we go back to the browser, if you notice, we are getting the name here, so we're getting Jane, right, and we're getting John Doe. Just to make that clear, I would add like a span here and make it somewhat bold. I'll just put an inline style. Right. This is a bad practice, but for the sake of this lesson, I don't want to bother myself with styling. That's fun. So this should be. So we have an error and this error here. So if I go back to the browser, so you could see now we have the person's first name and stuff. So you see, we have the data. We're using the data here in child 1. We're using the data in child 2. You could do the same in child 3. You could do the same in, whatever components, that comes under this provider. So if you have maybe if within child 1 you have a component, or if you have like a child 4 component or whatever, you understand. Oh, that doesn't matter, right? You understand. As long as it's within this provider, you can always get access to. You can always get access to the data, right? Good. So we see that we are passing data across, sharing data efficiently across our application. What I would like to do in this context, in this in the next step, is what we're talking about, which is updating the global states. So what we'll do is that we'll add like an input field to child 1, and the input field is going to update the state. And once it updates the state, let's see what happens. Let's see if we can make it reflect in a different component and see if this component can communicate using context API. So if I go to child 1, right, I would just add a div here, and I would add like an input field, right? Just a simple input field, right? And this input field is just like, the default is going to be text, by the way, so there's no need to add a type. But what I would say is I would add that unchanged to his input field, right? This unchanged is going to take a handle change function, const handle change. And I'm going to pass this unchanged function here, right? So I'm going to pass this unchanged function. This is going to give us, so when the user types into this input field, right, it's going to trigger this unchanged, this handle change. So it's the unchanged event listener is going to trigger this handle change, and we're going to get access to the event here. And this should be of type HTML inputs element, and so const value should be e dot target dot value, e dot target machine. So now if we go to the console, yeah, I think this should work. Yeah, the console is covered open. All right, so remember we had like this input and we just were console logging the value. So what that should give us is that if I should type in something here, I should say it in my console first. Name, that's the name. You could clear that and let's type my name. All right, good. So we're sure that once you call the onChange function, we're getting the value from the input. Yeah, but we're just putting that in a console. We are not doing anything with it. Remember, what we wanted to do is that we wanted to update, the parent, that's the global state, so to speak, the state of the parent component, right? Let me just show you something. Yeah, so what we want to do is that when the user types into this input, right, we want to update the states here, right? And we were already passing down the values down, but that those values are passing down. Like if I go to components, I go to child 2, I think. Yeah, we're passing down the value, but we're not using it. So what we want to do is that we want to have access to this set first name function that's going to help us update the parent state. So what I need to do, it's similar to the things I've done before. First, as always, you'd import use context, which from React, right, which is going to help you like get access to the context. And once you do that, you import the context object you want to use, right? So I would import this from the parent page. So I go to page and I would say dummy context. That's the context I want to use. So I could come here and say const context value or value from context, whatever you want. Let's just say value. Once again, just so that it's in the normal app, you're going to name this better, right? But this is just for demonstration. So I'd say use context. This is gonna once again take in the context object, right? Good. So we have access to that context in this value from context. What this value from context once again corresponds to, this value, what it corresponds to, it corresponds to this entire object we're passing in. So inside that object, we should now have access to set first name, right? So within my handle change function here, I would now say update parent state. And how I would do that, I would simply say value dot set first name, and I will pass in what's it called, the value that you see that TypeScript is giving me the inference that it accepts. It's a value which is a string, so I'll just pass in this value from the event or targeted value. Now, if we go back to our browser, I'll just format this to make things clearer. What should happen is that when I type into this input, it should update like so. When I type into, I'll close the console now, we no longer need it. When I type into the input here, it should update the name here, and it should also update that name here. So basically, Jerry should be gone when I type in. So let's say that I'll type in my name here, Rookie. So you could see that automatically it's been updated, right? Rookie. So that's the value here. If I change this to, what's a good name? Let's just say Johnson. Yeah. So you see that we're updating the global state, right, from the input, right? And I think you could also use your profiler to check this component stuff, to check that works properly. So I would just scroll down, I'll go to context provider, and if you check, you see that the first name here is being updated, right? So once again, you could do that as many times as you want, right? Let's say Linda. So you see that it's updating in real time as you type, right? So that's exactly how you would go about, like, what's it called? Also you can also say the children props and stuff if you want. But that's how you go about, like, updating the global state from the child component, right? So congratulations, we just, if I go back to page, right? So we could access the data from the parent, and now we are updating the global state, right? So we just did this, and yeah, that works. You could add one for last name if you want. So you could just do the same thing and say, baby last name. And you could have, I would just, this is not the best process, but I would just use an inline stuff that says, it's going to get access to the event here. Now that says set value from context dot set last name. And that's this event, once again, event dot target dot value. Right, you just take the event and you pass it in here. And so now if you come here, there should be like a last name. I have a typo, it doesn't matter. Right, so this should now update the last name. So if I say last name is now Beckham, football I like, right? I think it's David, that's his first name. So you see that this is updating, right? So we're updating the child component, we're updating the other component. So what we're doing is that we're updating the parent states, and because they are all part of the same provider and they have access to that value, they get updated also, right? These other components get updated also. So you see that this already has like a lot of application, right? This is a way you could go about like sharing data across your components. So a good example of this is a step form, which we are going to like demonstrate in another tutorial. And I think would be like if this, for example, was like a login form, like used for authentication, right? So when the user enters their information here and hits submit, and this could be, this child one could be, let's assume this is a nav bar or something, right? Yeah, this could be like a nav bar. And so you have like the username and stuff, being transferred from this login component and stuff. So yeah, it's just a way to share data across your components. So we achieved this. Now, what we'll just look at is how we'll just do some cleanups and how you organize this better. You understand in the next section, right? So how you organize your files better and stuff. For example, if you have multiple contexts, you don't want to define all of them in the home page and everything. So I'll give some tips and tricks on how to better organize your context in the next section, right? And how to like some best practice also. All right, thank you once again. If this has helped you, please like the video. Basically, I just want it as a feedback to know, and if there's anything you think I need to improve on, please let me know. You could drop a comment and feel free to subscribe, as I said. Let's go.